William stripped Camilla's family from all royal trusts. Okay, stay with me for a moment, because the order had already been signed when the palace began to understand what William had just done. According to the allegations surrounding this story, Prince William had approved a sweeping removal of Camilla's family from royal trust arrangements, cutting off their alleged connections to properties, private funds, and privileges tied to the crown. But that was only the part people could see. What made this case different was what happened inside the legal room afterward. Palace lawyers were not simply checking whether William had the authority to restructure the trusts. They were examining the documents that had supposedly protected Camilla's family's future. And somewhere inside those papers was an approval that would raise a question far more disturbing than money: who had authorized it? Hi viewers, if you believe royal privilege should belong to the crown and not be quietly passed around families, would you have supported William's decision? Comment yes if you think he did the right thing, because this story becomes much harder to dismiss once the lawyers begin turning the pages. The order had been completed before the palace could prepare a public explanation. That was the first problem. Staff were suddenly dealing with a decision they had not expected to announce, while senior figures were being forced to work out exactly what could be said and what had to remain inside the legal machinery of the crown. William had not walked into that morning meeting looking for a family confrontation. The alleged decision had been built around the royal trusts and the rights attached to them. The lawyers had placed the relevant paperwork before him. The documents were reviewed, questions were raised, pages were examined again. Then William signed. That signature changed the position of Camilla's relatives inside the story almost instantly. The alleged connections involving Camilla's children, grandchildren, and wider family were no longer being treated as permanent pathways into royal resources. Arrangements that had appeared capable of continuing into the future were suddenly being challenged. Access that had once seemed secure was now under review. And the timing could not have been worse. Outside, the palace was preparing for a public engagement. Staff were moving through their normal routines. Invitations had been handled, schedules had been arranged, cars were expected, public appearances were still on the calendar. Then the phones began to ring. One message became several. Several became dozens. Aides who had expected an ordinary day were suddenly trying to understand why a major royal financial decision had been made without the usual public buildup. People were asking the same questions in different rooms, often without receiving the same answers.
I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me.
The silence from the senior royals only made the situation more unsettling. Charles did not immediately step forward with an explanation. That absence mattered, because Camilla was not simply another member of the family. She was the queen consort, and the people affected by the order were members of her own family. Inside the palace, loyalties became difficult to read. Some staff understood the decision as an administrative reset. Others saw it as an unmistakable warning. There were those who believed William had finally decided that royal resources needed harder boundaries. There were others who suspected something more personal was driving the decision, but nobody yet knew how far the problem went. Camilla's reaction, according to the accounts surrounding the dispute, was one of disbelief followed by fury. The woman who had spent years navigating the most difficult levels of royal scrutiny was now facing a decision that reached directly into the position of the family she had brought into the royal circle. The most painful part was not simply that privileges were being questioned. It was that William had acted before she could stop him, and he had done it with lawyers sitting beside him. That detail mattered, because William could have handled the matter as a private family disagreement. Instead, the alleged decision was placed inside a formal legal process. That meant the argument could no longer be reduced to hurt feelings, old rivalries, or palace gossip. There had to be paperwork, there had to be reasons, there had to be a record. And records are dangerous when people disagree about what they were supposed to authorize. The first reports of the decision quickly moved beyond the palace walls. Commentators began discussing whether William was establishing a harder boundary between the monarchy and relatives who did not form part of the direct line of succession. Supporters saw something they had wanted for years: a reset, A monarchy where proximity to the crown did not automatically become a claim on royal property or royal money. Others were more cautious. They wondered whether William had gone too far. They questioned whether a future king should be making such sweeping changes while his father was still on the throne. But then another detail began circulating. The lawyers were still working. That meant the signed order was not the end of the matter, it was the beginning. The legal team had started comparing the current arrangements against earlier trust documents. They were looking for the language that had allowed Camilla's family to remain connected to certain royal resources. At first, the paperwork appeared complicated rather than sinister. There were amendments, there were revisions, there were references to access. There were provisions that seemed to have been added at different stages. Any one of those changes could have been explained as ordinary administrative work. But the lawyers were not looking at one page, they were looking at the pattern, and the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. A document could be amended because circumstances changed. A provision could be rewritten because a property changed hands. A trust could be reorganized because a royal household changed. But what if several amendments all pointed in the same direction? What if each change made long-term access easier? What if the people positioned to benefit were connected to the same family? And what if some of those arrangements appeared to survive long after the circumstances that originally justified them had disappeared? That was when the atmosphere inside the legal room changed.
We tried to make sure we give them the security and the safety that they need. And we're a very open family, so we talk about things that bother us and things that trouble us. But you never quite know the knock-on effects it can have.
The lawyers began asking questions that were no longer administrative. Who requested the amendments? Who reviewed them? Who approved them? Who knew they existed? And most importantly, who expected them to remain in force after William eventually became king? The last question was the one that could not be ignored. Because William's decision was not only about what existed that morning, it was about what might still exist years later. The alleged trust arrangements could have created something far more lasting than temporary access. They could have established a framework in which members of Camilla's family remained connected to royal resources even after the crown passed from Charles to William. That possibility changed the stakes completely. Now William's order looked less like a sudden punishment and more like an attempt to stop something before it became permanent. But there was still one problem. The lawyers had not yet reached the document that would make the entire palace nervous. They were still working through the records when one piece of paperwork demanded a second look. The wording was unusual. The approval appeared to come from a senior royal. The name carried authority. The document appeared to have the weight needed to support the arrangement. But there was a problem with the approval itself. The senior royal connected to it allegedly said they had never signed it. That was the moment the trust dispute stopped being merely a battle over Camilla's family. If the document was genuine, someone had authorized a continuation of privileges that William was now removing. If it was not genuine, then someone had attempted to make an arrangement appear officially approved when it was not. Either possibility was explosive, and William still did not know who had put it there. The palace had spent years protecting its documents, its procedures, and its reputation for continuity. Now, one disputed approval threatened to turn a private restructuring into a question about who had been preparing the royal family's future behind closed doors. The order had already been signed. Camilla's family's position had already changed. The public had already begun choosing sides. But the lawyers had found something that could make the entire decision look very different. And if William's opponents thought removing the trusts was the worst thing that could happen, they had not yet seen what the lawyers were about to uncover. Stay with this story, because the next part goes straight inside the documents, and what the legal team found there was far worse than anyone in the palace was prepared to confront. The first thing the lawyers did was not challenge William's order. They challenged the paperwork that had existed before it. That distinction mattered. William had already stripped Camilla's family from the royal trust arrangements described in the allegations surrounding the case. Now the legal team had to determine whether those arrangements had ever been properly created, expanded, or approved in the first place. The files were brought together in one review: trust schedules, property references, financial amendments, internal approvals, requests concerning continued access. Nothing was treated as harmless simply because it carried an official-looking heading. The lawyers began with the amendments. One change appeared to extend an existing privilege. Another appeared to clarify access to a property. A later provision seemed to preserve an advantage beyond the period for which it had originally been discussed. Separately, none looked explosive. Together, they raised a harder question. Why did so many changes appear to move in the same direction? The concern was not that every amendment proved wrongdoing. It did not. The concern was the accumulation of changes that, according to the story's allegations, could have left members of Camilla's family with continuing connections to royal assets. That was enough to make the legal team slow down. They started tracing the paper trail backward. Who had requested each change? Who had received it? Who had reviewed it? Who had returned it for revision? And who had finally approved it? The answers were not sitting neatly on one page. The trail ran through different offices and different stages of palace administration. That made the investigation more difficult. It also made it more serious. A royal trust is not simply a private bank account with a royal name attached. In this story, the trusts represented a boundary between institutional resources and personal family interests. If that boundary had been gradually weakened, William's decision suddenly had a different purpose. He was not merely removing relatives, he was closing a route. The legal team then examined the property records. One set of records allegedly connected a private villa to guests associated with Laura Lopes's art network. Another set raised questions about a former royal stable and commercial connections associated with Tom Parker Bowles. Those claims needed verification, and the lawyers treated them as leads rather than conclusions. The important issue was the same in both cases. Who had authorized the access? Who received the benefit? And was the use consistent with the purpose of the royal asset? The questions became more uncomfortable when financial summaries were compared with the property records. Some entries that had previously looked like ordinary administrative costs suddenly required explanation. Other records appeared to have been amended after the original arrangement was made. Again, there was no single document that answered everything, but the pattern was beginning to take shape. William's concern had been about future access. The lawyers were now discovering evidence that suggested the question had existed for much longer than anyone publicly understood. That was when Princess Anne was brought deeper into the review. She was not asked to defend William, she was asked to examine the structure. Her reputation inside the royal family made her involvement significant. She had spent decades working within the institution, and she was not known for treating royal administration as a stage for family sentiment. The files were placed before her. She read them. Then she reportedly asked for the earlier versions. That request mattered because a revised document can hide as much as it reveals. The original wording could show what the arrangement was supposed to accomplish. The amended wording could show what someone later wanted it to accomplish. The difference between those two versions became one of the most important parts of the investigation. The lawyers began comparing dates. One amendment appeared after another internal discussion. Another followed a change in palace responsibilities. Then came a provision that seemed to preserve access for longer than expected. There was no dramatic confession, no single message saying what the family wanted. Instead, there was something more difficult to dismiss: a sequence. And sequences force investigators to ask whether separate decisions were really separate. By then, William had a much clearer picture of why the trust arrangements had become a problem, but the public still knew almost nothing about the legal review. That silence was deliberate. If the palace announced every discovery before it had been verified, the dispute could turn into a public accusation without evidence strong enough to support it. So the legal team continued quietly. Camilla's position, meanwhile, became increasingly difficult. Her representatives could argue that the arrangements had been created through legitimate palace processes. They could insist that family access was being misunderstood. They could request a confidential legal review. And that is exactly what the story alleges happened. The request put Charles in an uncomfortable position. If he supported the review, Camilla could see it as a failure to defend her family. If he rejected it, William could argue that the Crown was refusing to examine its own records. There was no easy answer. The dispute was now moving beyond William and Camilla. It was becoming a test of whether the royal household would investigate itself when the records raised uncomfortable questions. The review also forced the lawyers to separate three things that had been blurred together: access, benefit, and control. Access meant being allowed to use a royal property or facility under conditions. Benefit meant receiving some financial or practical advantage from that access. Control was something else entirely. Control meant having a continuing influence over how an asset was managed, who could use it, or whether an arrangement survived a change in the royal household. That distinction became critical. An arrangement could appear harmless if it was temporary. It looked different if its wording allowed it to continue after the people who created it were no longer responsible for the crown. The lawyers examined language rather than appearances. They looked for words that extended time periods. They checked whether beneficiaries could be replaced or added. They examined clauses that referred to successors. They checked whether any privilege depended on a person's royal position or simply on an existing family connection. One phrase kept drawing attention because it suggested continuity beyond the immediate circumstances. That was the kind of wording William's reform was designed to challenge. The issue was no longer whether a relative had enjoyed a benefit once. The issue was whether a temporary family connection had been converted into a lasting institutional advantage. That distinction became crucial when the lawyers reconstructed the approval trail. The disputed signature was not sitting alone. It was attached to a chain of decisions. Somewhere inside that chain was the person who had expected the arrangement to survive. Then the lawyers found something that changed the tone of the entire review. It was not a property record. It was not an account summary. It was not another amendment. It was an approval. The name attached to that approval carried serious authority. On paper, it appeared to provide the legitimacy needed for the arrangement to continue. But when the legal team checked the approval against the senior royal connected to it, the answer was unexpected. The royal allegedly denied ever giving that approval. That single contradiction created a new problem. If the approval was genuine, why deny it? If it was not genuine, who placed it inside the trust record, and why? The lawyers now had to stop asking only whether Camilla's family had benefited from the arrangements. They had to ask whether someone had been preparing a future in which those arrangements would survive. That possibility was far more serious than William had expected when he signed the order. Because if someone had attempted to secure long-term access before the next reign, then the trust dispute was no longer about what Camilla's family had received. It was about what someone had been trying to guarantee. And that question pointed directly toward the next stage of the investigation. William had removed the family from the trusts. Now the lawyers needed to know who had tried to keep them there. If you think that question deserves an answer, do not scroll away or stay silent. Subscribe, share this story, and stay with it, because the next chapter exposes why that disputed approval could turn a royal family argument into something much bigger. The document had created a question William could not answer from a balance sheet. Who was protecting Camilla's family, and why? The legal review had reached the point where paperwork alone could not explain the pressure building inside the palace. The disputed approval had changed the nature of the case, but it had also exposed something more personal. William was no longer looking only at royal administration. He was looking at what the arrangements represented for the future of his family. That was where Diana entered the story. For William, the argument over access and privilege could not be separated completely from his memories of the woman who had raised him. The connection was emotional, not legal. Nothing in the trust records could prove what William felt about his mother's treatment, and no document could establish her intentions decades later. But within the story, those memories became part of the reason the issue carried such weight for him. He had grown up watching the monarchy manage private pain behind public ceremony. He had seen how quickly family disagreements could become institutional problems. He had also watched his mother struggle with a royal system that seemed determined to protect itself even when individuals inside it were hurting. Now William was facing a different version of the same problem. This time, the pressure was not coming from photographers or public interviews. It was coming from documents that could shape access to royal resources long after the people who created them had left their positions. That distinction unsettled him. The question was no longer whether Camilla's relatives deserved sympathy. The question was whether personal relationships could create permanent institutional privileges. William's concern, as portrayed in this account, was that once such privileges became normal, removing them later would be almost impossible. Catherine noticed the change in him. She was accustomed to seeing William carry pressure without showing much of it. But the trust dispute had reached something deeper. He was not simply dealing with a complicated palace decision. He was confronting the possibility that the institution he would one day inherit could contain arrangements designed to outlast the people who had negotiated them. Catherine's position was careful. She did not need to declare Camilla's family guilty of anything. She needed to understand why the documents had been structured as they were. That restraint mattered. It kept the argument focused on evidence instead of turning it into another royal family feud. But the emotional tension continued to rise. William eventually spoke privately with Princess Anne about what the investigation was doing to him. The conversation, as described in the supplied story, was not about revenge. It was about the feeling that boundaries had been allowed to disappear. Anne listened. She did not offer a long speech. Instead, she gave William a blunt warning: stop letting them win. Those words became important because William had spent years learning that royal conflicts rarely end when one person thinks they have been settled. They return through appointments, privileges, family alliances, and carefully worded agreements. If he wanted the future monarchy to operate differently, he could not wait until every arrangement had become entrenched. That was the point at which the dispute became a question of legacy. William did not need to prove that every person connected to Camilla had acted improperly. He needed to decide whether the institution should continue granting access based on family proximity. His answer was increasingly clear: no. That position created a direct clash with Camilla. Her family had already been pushed away from the trust structure. Now the legal review threatened to expose the reasoning behind earlier arrangements. From Camilla's perspective, the process could look less like reform and more like an attempt to erase her family's place around the crown. That interpretation gave her a reason to fight. Her lawyers began preparing for a confidential review. Questions were raised about the authority behind the restructuring. Arguments were considered over whether earlier promises or arrangements could still have legal significance. Camilla's frustration also placed Charles under pressure. He was not simply a husband watching his wife lose influence. He was the reigning king watching his son reshape an area of royal administration that touched the family directly. Every option carried a cost. Backing William could make Camilla feel abandoned. Backing Camilla could make William believe his father was protecting personal interests over institutional reform. Remaining silent could make both sides suspect the worst. Charles chose silence, at least publicly. That silence became its own message. Inside the palace, staff began watching every movement for clues. Who was meeting whom? Which lawyers were being consulted? Which documents were being requested? Which offices were suddenly receiving calls? The uncertainty created an atmosphere in which rumor could move faster than evidence. Outside, the public argument became even sharper. Some supporters treated William's decision as a long overdue boundary. Others believed the monarchy was becoming consumed by another internal power struggle. Social media turned the dispute into competing versions of the same story. For one side, William was protecting the crown. For another, he was settling an old family grievance. The truth, if it existed somewhere between those interpretations, was still buried inside the documents. Then Camilla's response became more forceful. She was not prepared to accept that her family's future could disappear through a single order and a legal review. According to the accounts surrounding the dispute, she began contacting allies and exploring every available route to challenge the decision. That included private legal advice. It also brought old royal tensions back into the room. The story describes Prince Andrew as one of the figures approached for support, although the extent of any involvement remains part of the disputed account. His presence mattered because it signaled that the disagreement could draw in people with their own grievances against the modern direction of the monarchy. Camilla's strategy was straightforward: challenge the legal basis, question the process, put pressure on Charles, make William explain why his family's access had been removed. But there was a problem. The more aggressively the challenge developed, the more attention the lawyers paid to the documents themselves. Every argument about entitlement required evidence. Every claim about approval required a record. Every promise required a date. And every signature required a person who could stand behind it. That last point was becoming dangerous. The disputed approval was still sitting inside the paperwork. Camilla's side needed it to support the legitimacy of the earlier arrangement. William's side needed to understand how it had appeared. The lawyers needed to determine whether it was authentic. And the senior royal whose name was connected to it had allegedly denied authorizing it. That meant the next step could not be handled as a family negotiation. It required a forensic examination of the record. The lawyers began checking the document against surrounding correspondence, versions of the trust, administrative notes, and the chronology of approvals. The deeper they went, the more troubling the sequence became. The suspicious document did not simply sit at the end of the story. It appeared to sit at a point where the future of the arrangement could have been secured. That was the detail William could not ignore. If the document had been properly authorized, he needed to know why the senior royal denied signing it. If the document had not been properly authorized, someone had created a serious problem inside a system that depended on trust. Either way, the consequences reached beyond Camilla's relatives. They reached the crown itself. And this was where William's private anger became secondary to something larger. A future king could not allow the rules surrounding royal assets to depend on documents whose origins could not be explained. The question was becoming brutally simple. Who wanted Camilla's family protected after William inherited the throne? That question also changed the emotional balance inside the palace. Camilla was no longer only fighting for her relatives. William was no longer only defending a reform. Charles was no longer only trying to keep peace. The lawyers were now examining whether someone had tried to shape the future before the future arrived. And the timing made it worse. The disputed approval had not appeared in isolation. Its position inside the sequence suggested someone understood what it could accomplish. If accepted, it could preserve an arrangement beyond the people who created it and carry that privilege into a reign. That possibility was enough to make the next discovery potentially explosive, because the document was not the only thing that needed explaining. The person behind it did. And once the lawyers followed that trail, the royal family's private dispute was about to become a direct confrontation with the integrity of its own records. If this story has convinced you that royal privilege should never be protected by silence, subscribe, share this with someone who follows the crown, and stay for the next chapter, because the lawyers are about to confront the one document that could change everything. The signature was not where the lawyers expected it to be. It sat inside a document that appeared ordinary at first glance, buried among pages of trust language, administrative notes, and amendments. But one line connected the arrangement to a senior royal who, according to the allegations surrounding the case, later said the approval had never been given. That changed the investigation. The lawyers stopped treating the disputed trust as a complicated family arrangement and began treating the document itself as evidence that needed to be tested. They checked the date first, then the wording, then the approval trail. Every detail had to match the surrounding record. A genuine authorization should leave a recognizable trail. There should be correspondence before it, administrative action after it, and people who could explain why the document existed. Instead, the trail raised more questions. The wording appeared designed to preserve access beyond the immediate circumstances that had created it. The provision did not simply describe what could happen at that moment. It appeared capable of carrying an advantage forward. That was precisely what William had been trying to prevent. The lawyers examined earlier versions of the trust. The language changed. They compared the amendments. The language changed again. They checked the sequence of approvals. Another gap appeared. None of those findings by themselves proved that anyone had forged a document or deliberately misled the crown. But together they created a problem that could not be dismissed as routine administration. The senior royal named in the disputed approval was approached. The answer was reportedly direct. No such approval had been authorized. The lawyers now had two competing realities. The document said one thing. The person whose authority appeared on it said another. That contradiction became the most dangerous fact in the entire investigation, because royal trusts depend on authorization. If an approval cannot be verified, then every later decision relying upon that approval becomes vulnerable. The legal team began reconstructing the document's journey. Where had it originated? Which office received it? Who circulated it? Who had access to the version containing the disputed approval? And why had the document remained inside the records long enough to influence later arrangements? The questions became increasingly specific. Someone had drafted the language. Someone had reviewed it. Someone had placed it into the administrative chain. Someone had expected it to be accepted. The lawyers did not need to assume a conspiracy. They needed to establish the facts. That made the investigation more serious, not less. They examined correspondence connected to the trust. They checked whether the language used in the disputed document appeared elsewhere. They compared signatures and approval formats. They looked for inconsistencies in dates and references. Then they found another concern. The disputed approval appeared at a point in the chronology where it could have protected the continuation of the arrangement into the future. That mattered because William's entire reform was built around the opposite principle. Royal privileges were supposed to follow royal responsibility. They were not supposed to become permanent family entitlements simply because someone had once been close to the crown. The document threatened that boundary. If accepted, it could give Camilla's relatives an argument for continued access. If rejected, it raised the question of why anyone had attempted to create that argument. Charles was informed that the legal review had reached this stage. The pressure on him intensified. This was no longer a disagreement that could be settled by asking William and Camilla to compromise. A compromise could not repair an approval whose authenticity was disputed. Charles now had to face the possibility that the institution he led contained a document that could not be explained. His silence became harder to maintain. Camilla, meanwhile, had another problem. The legal challenge she had been preparing depended on the legitimacy of the earlier arrangements. If those arrangements rested partly on a document whose approval was being questioned, her position became much weaker. She could still argue that her family had acted within the rules they were given. She could still demand that the trust changes be reviewed. But the central question had shifted. Who created the rules, and who authorized them? The answer could determine whether William's decision looked like an excessive act against Camilla's family or a necessary response to a flawed system. That distinction mattered enormously. Outside the palace, commentators were already choosing their version of events. Some portrayed William as a future king finally drawing a line around crown resources. Others saw an old family conflict being dressed up as reform. But neither side had the complete picture. The complete picture was still inside the legal files, and the lawyers were not finished. They examined the disputed approval against the people who would have been expected to process it. They looked for meeting records, instructions, correspondence, and administrative confirmations. The absence of a normal confirmation did not prove fraud, but it made the document harder to defend. Then came another uncomfortable discovery. The language used in the document appeared to anticipate a future transition. It referred, directly or indirectly, to circumstances beyond the immediate period in which the arrangement had been created. That meant the lawyers had to consider a disturbing possibility. Someone may have been thinking about what would happen after Charles. Not next month, not next year, the next reign. That possibility placed William at the center of the matter, even though the alleged arrangement had existed before he became king. The trust could have become a bridge between one reign and another. If the bridge remained intact, Camilla's family might retain a position that William did not want them to have. If William destroyed it, he would be accused of using future authority to punish relatives connected to his father's wife. The legal team therefore had to separate motive from evidence. That distinction became essential. William's personal feelings could explain why the issue mattered to him. They could not establish whether the paperwork was valid. The lawyers needed proof. They returned to the disputed document. The senior royal's denial was checked again. The signature was examined again. The surrounding records were reviewed again. Then the legal team reached the conclusion that changed the atmosphere inside the palace. They could not treat the approval as an unquestioned foundation for the trust arrangement. The document required further investigation. That meant the matter could not be closed quietly. A disputed royal authorization inside a trust record was not a minor administrative error. It raised questions about accountability. It raised questions about access. And it raised the most important question of all. Who had expected nobody to look closely enough to notice? William was given the briefing. There was another reason the lawyers refused to rush. A document can be suspicious without being false. A missing record can reflect poor administration without proving deliberate deception. That was why the review became so methodical. Every allegation had to be separated from what could actually be established. They checked whether the senior royal had delegated authority to another official. They checked whether a secretary could have signed or processed the document on that person's behalf. They checked whether the wording matched other trust instruments created during the same period. Nothing could be assumed. Yet each check produced another complication. If authority had been delegated, where was the delegation? If an official had processed the approval, where was the instruction? If the wording was standard, why did the document appear to carry a different meaning when applied to the future? The unanswered questions accumulated. That accumulation was what frightened the palace, and William now understood the consequence. That was the problem William inherited. If he allowed the arrangement to survive while the questions remained unresolved, he could inherit the same problem later. If he dismantled it now, he would trigger a family confrontation that could damage his relationship with his father and stepmother. There was no painless option. There was only a choice between preserving silence and confronting the record. He listened without interruption. The issue before him was now larger than Camilla's relatives. It concerned the integrity of the system he was expected to inherit. If the documents were legitimate, he needed to understand why a senior royal denied authorizing them. If the documents were not legitimate, he needed to know who had inserted the approval and what they expected to gain. Either answer carried consequences. For Charles, it threatened the authority of his reign. For Camilla, it threatened the remaining legal basis for her family's claims. For William, it presented a choice that could define how he approached the monarchy before he ever wore the crown. He could leave the matter buried under family compromise, or he could expose every part of the arrangement and accept whatever damage followed. The palace had spent years relying on discretion. Now discretion was becoming the problem. The disputed approval had turned a financial review into an institutional investigation. And the person who appeared to have the most to lose was no longer simply Camilla. It was whoever had expected that document to survive unnoticed. Before moving to the final confrontation, remember what is now at stake. William has already removed Camilla's family from the trusts, but the lawyers have uncovered a question that cannot be silenced. Who tried to secure their future through an approval a senior royal says was never given? If that question matters to you, subscribe and share this story instead of letting another royal controversy disappear behind palace silence. Because the final move is where William decides what happens to those trusts for good. The final decision was no longer about whether Camilla's family should remain connected to royal trusts. It was about whether William would allow a disputed document to determine the future of the crown. The lawyers had reached their limit. They could not certify the disputed approval as an unquestioned foundation for continued access. They could not simply erase it either. The record existed, the questions existed, and William now had to decide what happened next. He chose the harder option. The trust structure would be rebuilt. The purpose was presented as institutional rather than personal. Royal assets would be tied to royal responsibility, succession, and clearly defined duties. Family proximity alone would not create a permanent claim. That decision had immediate consequences for Camilla's relatives. Their previous connections to the arrangements would not simply roll forward. The future beneficiaries would be determined by the new structure, not by assumptions created during an earlier period of the monarchy. For Camilla, that was the point where resistance became almost impossible. She could challenge the process. She could question the interpretation of earlier agreements. She could ask for another review, but she could not easily make the disputed approval disappear. Charles now faced the final choice. He could intervene for his wife and risk undermining William's authority, or he could accept the restructuring and acknowledge that the monarchy was entering a different phase. The tension between father and son was no longer hidden behind schedules and official appearances. William had made his position clear. Charles had to decide whether the institution came before the family dispute. The final family discussion was therefore less dramatic than the rumors surrounding it, but more consequential. The arguments centered on authority, continuity, and the purpose of royal resources. Camilla's position was that her family should not be punished because of questions surrounding documents they did not personally create. William's position was different. If a privilege depended on a disputed foundation, it could not simply be preserved because removing it was uncomfortable. That principle became the basis for the final restructuring. The legal team separated the questionable arrangements from the future system. Existing records would remain available for scrutiny. New provisions would be written more narrowly. Access would depend on defined responsibilities rather than family connection alone. The future generation of the direct succession would be placed at the center of the arrangement. George, Charlotte, and Louis therefore became symbols of the new approach within the story. Their inclusion was not presented as a reward. It represented a basic institutional principle. Royal resources should serve the future crown. That distinction allowed William to frame the decision as reform rather than revenge. But the personal consequences remained. Camilla's influence over the disputed arrangements had ended. Charles had lost the ability to keep the issue comfortably inside the family. And William had accepted that changing the system would inevitably change relationships inside it. The public reaction became another turning point. Those who had supported William saw the restructuring as evidence that he was prepared to confront uncomfortable questions before inheriting the throne. Others remained suspicious of his motives and believed the dispute had become too personal. The debate continued because there was no simple villain and no simple explanation. There was only a royal family facing a document that had raised questions about authority. That was what made the disputed approval so important. Even if later investigation produced an innocent explanation, the existence of the contradiction had exposed a weakness in the system. A trust arrangement should not depend on uncertainty about who authorized it. A royal privilege should not depend on assumptions about who will inherit it. And a future monarchy cannot function properly if its rules can be quietly expanded without clear accountability. The significance of that boundary reached beyond one family. Once a royal household accepts that an informal connection can become a lasting financial expectation, reversing it becomes politically difficult. Every successor inherits the consequences. Every new agreement creates another layer of precedent. That is why the lawyers treated the wording so seriously. They were not only protecting today's accounts, they were determining what tomorrow's king would inherit, what tomorrow's relatives could expect, and what tomorrow's palace would be forced to defend. In that sense, the final restructuring was also an attempt to prevent another dispute from appearing under the next reign again. William's decision therefore became bigger than the original order. He was not merely stripping Camilla's family from royal trusts. He was defining what those trusts were supposed to mean. That was the real power shift. The story began with a signature removing access. It ended with a new principle governing access. The question of Camilla's family became the test case. The disputed approval became the warning, and William's response became the message. The monarchy could no longer rely on tradition alone when deciding who received institutional privilege. For Charles, the moment carried a difficult personal reality. His son was preparing the institution for a future that Charles could not fully control. The father remained king, but the future king was beginning to shape the rules he would inherit. For Camilla, the outcome was equally stark. Her family had not simply lost a set of financial connections. They had lost the expectation that closeness to the queen consort could guarantee a continuing place inside royal arrangements. That was the boundary William wanted to establish, and it explained why the decision had shocked so many people. The strongest part of the story was never the amount of money involved. It was the question of who had the right to decide what happened to the crown's resources after one reign ended and another began. That question remains the reason the disputed approval matters. If the document was legitimate, the palace still had to explain why the senior royal connected to it denied authorizing it. If it was not legitimate, the deeper question became unavoidable. Who expected it to pass unnoticed? That question may never produce the clean answer that public audiences want. Royal institutions rarely provide every private detail, and allegations surrounding palace records can remain disputed for years. But the controversy exposed something important. Power is not only exercised through titles. It is exercised through documents, access, appointments, property, and rules that determine who remains close to the institution when public attention moves elsewhere. William's alleged restructuring attacked that mechanism directly, and that is why the decision carried such symbolic weight. It told the royal family that the next reign would not necessarily preserve every arrangement created during the previous one. It told relatives that proximity would not automatically become entitlement. And it told palace administrators that every approval could eventually be examined. The emotional story surrounding Diana also remained part of William's motivation in the account, but the final decision rested on a broader principle. A future king could not build credibility by allowing private loyalty to override institutional clarity. He had to choose the system he believed he would one day inherit. That choice cost him. It created tension with Charles. It deepened the divide with Camilla. It exposed the monarchy to another wave of public scrutiny. But it also gave William something he had not possessed before: a clear line. Camilla's family would not be allowed to inherit institutional privilege simply because the family had become close to the crown. The trusts would serve the crown, the rules would serve the crown, and the future would be decided by the responsibilities attached to the monarchy, not by private expectations. That is where the story ends, but the question does not. Because somewhere inside the records was a disputed approval that should never have created this much uncertainty. And until the origin of that document is fully understood, the most uncomfortable part of the story remains unanswered. Who was preparing Camilla's family's future before William ever reached the throne? That question is more important than the argument over money. It is more important than the palace rumors, and it is more important than the family confrontation. Because if someone really attempted to secure a future royal privilege through an approval that was never given, then William's order was not simply a punishment, it was a barrier. A barrier between private influence and public institution. Whether history ultimately judges that decision as necessary reform or a deeply personal act will depend on what can actually be proven. But one thing is certain within the controversy: the royal trusts became the battlefield, and the disputed document became the reason nobody could simply walk away. If you believe royal privilege should answer to accountability rather than silence, do not let this story end here. Like this video, share it with someone who follows the crown, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications, because staying silent only lets the same questions disappear again, and the next story coming to this channel gets even worse, with another royal decision that could expose what happened behind closed doors.